Hi, welcome to the Together Talks. I'm Alan Miller, co-founder of the Together Association, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Alastair Donald, who's Associate Director of the Academy of Ideas, as well as a number of initiatives that we'll talk about a bit more. Welcome to the Together Talks.
Thanks, Alan.
Just firstly, tell us a little bit about the history of the Academy of Ideas. How long's it been going? Tell us a bit about that.
Well, set up in 2000 with the aim of shaping public debate. Debate was a time of politics had become fairly technocratic and managerial and fairly boring, and we wanted to inject some ideas back into the political realm, not only in the sense of narrow party politics, but to make sure that the big issues of the day, from science to technological futures to all the issues that were starting to emerge in the arts and cultural sphere, were all properly discussed and analysed and scrutinised and debated over, because that really wasn't happening in the way that we felt it should be at the time.
And when that was done, it was quite unique then. I mean, there were some sorts of lectures and debates you'd go at, like institutions, art institutions or things like that, but it wasn't really that kind of sense of a public debate like that so much, was there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, people were writing numerous books and lots of people were doing research and all the rest of it, but we felt that ideas were often discussed in a very narrow way. So, for example, an author would come and talk about their book, but it might be to a group of people who were experts in whatever subject the book was written about. And we felt that those ideas need to be explored in a bit of a wider way, where the expert or the author of the book could come in and they could talk about some of the things that they'd written about, but in a way that was more engaging, of a wider intellectual discussion and debate, and that we wanted to create in society. So it was about broadening people's horizons out and trying to push beyond the fairly narrow discussions that were dominant at the time.
And you've been at a number of different venues over those years, including the Barbican, and now you're around the corner in Westminster. So how do you think things have changed since then? I mean, that sense which the public was not necessarily engaged in debate and discussion, you've been going for some time now. How would you calibrate the relationship between some of the ideas that are happening, the things that are going on in the world, and how the public is engaged with that or not?
Well, I think politics have become very narrow in particular, and as I said, very managerial and technocratic. And we thought that, quite often the way that things are discussed is that there's an assumed outcome to a situation. Take environmentalism, for example. The assumed outcome is that we all need to be more sustainable. And so the only debate that you can then have is a series of experts giving technical solutions to how to get to that sustainable outcome. And we thought, well, actually, we need to look at these things and question the first principles of the thing. So in environmentalism, you think, well, why is it that this philosophical idea about how society needs to work in terms of its relationship to changing climates and all the other environmental issues that were being raised at the time, why is it that you can't question the first principles of them? Why is it that, for example, the way that we think about human society, which for centuries we thought about in a way that human society needed to shape the environment and shape nature for its own benefit, had suddenly become reduced to a situation where the environment came first and we needed to creep around and observe the presumed limits of what you could do in the environment. So it's about having a bigger discussion and getting away from the narrow sort of technical prescriptions into a bigger debate about the first principles.
Yeah, so I have noticed, I've spoken at the Battle of Ideas Festival and some of the other things you've done, that there is a sense in which there's a real appetite to discuss and engage across the board. So the audiences are really very good as well as the panels, and the people with differing ideas, which you seem to have avoided the falling into the kind of echo chamber somewhat, right? Where you've got people with different views that do discuss them civilly, and then it's not just shouting or I mean, but how much do you think that is kind of can percolate into society? I mean, obviously it's an aspiration, I guess, but because it does seem like much more in society there's less of that. There's a kind of people get reinforced by their own ideas. There isn't often an exchange like that. How much of that do you think is a serious issue?
Yeah, I think it's a very serious issue. I mean, we live in a society that's dominated by issues like the culture wars, where uh, identity as a form of politics has come to dominate. And what that means is a very tricky situation where political discussion that used to be about how you create the future has become undermined by a very narrow viewpoint of we are a particular identity and we want to get those points of view across based on our identity. So people are hemmed into thinking about things in that narrow way, and it becomes a question of people. I mean, people talk about groupthink or trapped in identity silos or echo chambers, and it does become quite difficult to create a more open discussion where people can escape some of the very sort of personal identifications that they hold, and that's understandable in the way that politics has gone. But our aim with Battle of Ideas is to bring people out of those narrow identities and to create a more open discussion and debate, which is not easy at the moment. But we're very, very strong on the idea that people can come along and they're old enough and capable enough to deal with difficult ideas, and we're very much a free speech festival. We welcome free thinkers who are prepared to stand up, challenge all the sort of orthodoxies that we see today, and actually to have a more open discussion. And to the most part, I think we achieve that.
And free speech is definitely something that's contested highly these days. I mean, you don't want to caricature the thing, but on the campuses, particularly in the university, but also across society in many ways, we've seen recently with the Twitter files and others, kind of a sense in which you're not allowed to say that, whichever arena it might be. How do you see the relationship between what you're doing with the Academy of Ideas, the Battle of Ideas Festival, and interacting with that, with what's going on in the public sphere more? Is it? How do you see that?
Well, I think that the public sphere is the sphere where we think that ideas should be explored, and we don't think there should be constraints on the way that people explore these ideas. I think that people should be free to raise whatever issues they want. They should be free to argue the position that they hold, and there should be no constraints on doing that, which is not to say that we don't think people should be challenged, because the Battle of Ideas is the place where ideas can be raised, but also people can challenge. And to some extent, there's a reticence to come to judgment these days, to come to really to be critical. I mean, often we hear this idea that people are overly judgmental. And at the same time, actually, we live in a society which is very relativistic and kind of there's a little bit of an anything goes mentality. So we're trying to find a balance in the middle where people are completely free to state their ideas, but also free to judge the worth of the ideas that other people state. So you can have somewhere meeting in the middle, you can have a more constructive public dialogue about these things, where free to speak, but also free to judge what people say.
It's fascinating because, at least it seems to me that in the last few years, and a lot of people for a long time, and at the Battle of Ideas especially, have talked about kind of the end of the left and the right and those old sort of alliances, certainly in the sense of their relationship to the public. But there was still kind of, as you sort of said, a bit of the kind of identity-based thing where people have an understanding through their identity of certain things, and there's maybe a legacy of that. What's been really interesting, if you look at the things that have been really enormous in the last 10 years, let's say in the UK with Brexit and then with the COVID, both the experience of it and the responses, and then people's views on that. And also to what you were talking about, the questions of net zero and the environment, things like that, that you've got, it seems like there are different people asking different questions. Sometimes they align and they agree on some things very clearly, but then they have very different views on other things. And it seems like many of those things are being all thrown up in the air now. And there's it seems like there's a lot of attempts to work out things, but not necessarily with those old kind of frameworks. How do you see all of that?
Well, I think the old frameworks thing is interesting, because so often we have a language and a vocabulary and a set of political concepts, if you like, that seem a little bit outdated just now. I mean, if you think about even very, terms we're all very familiar with, liberalism and conservatism, for example. I mean, quite often what people think of those terms embody is actually very different to what they thought they embodied in the past. So we have it's quite difficult today to discuss these things. I think it's almost creating a situation where we need to talk about the principles of things rather than to get too hung up on the descriptions and the political language that to some extent is hangover from the past. So if we can create a situation where people are completely free and open to discuss the principles, then hopefully we can escape some of the baggage of yesteryear and the categories. People hurl labels around just now, neo-fascists or cultural Marxists or whatever. But what do they mean? I mean, they kind of don't really seem in some ways to describe a political reality, a kind of set of ideas. There is much epithets that are used to kind of hurl abuse at an identity, an assumed identity that people have. So if we can start to escape that and leave that baggage behind, then I think we can all have a much more productive, constructive dialogue.
One thing that's certainly interesting is another one of your initiatives. Well, there's been a couple. One is Debating Matters, which we should talk a bit about, but where you get sixth formers to debate issues and you kind of rigorously challenge them. Just as a note, I've been to some of those and I've been really highly impressed. And also Living Freedom. And I wonder, before we talk about them, sometimes, and it's really important not to just caricature things, but sometimes people say, well, young people just don't care about anything more. They're not interested, they're apolitical, they're cynical. We clearly, though, we do see that young people are involved in some things. They're interested in some single issue things and also other issues. I'm wondering how you think about it, how you see the relationship to young people and ideas and politics and change or not,
Yeah, well, Debating Matters and Living Freedom, those initiatives are organised under an educational charity side of the work that we do. And I think you're right. I mean, school education has, some people call it indoctrination as much as education these days. And, we can argue the toss about the extent to which that's true. But it definitely is the case that young people in schools are perhaps less encouraged these days to really think through concepts and ideas. And what we want to do with Debating Matters, which is the school's sixth form debating competition, is to offer young people an opportunity to really engage with some quite tricky, difficult contemporary issues. So, for example, we will create a debate in the school is not just a case of getting them to roll up 10 minutes in advance and to argue the toss over something, but we create these quite carefully crafted topic guides, which we issue them a month in advance, and we encourage them to read and to think in advance of the debate. And not only to read their own side of the argument, to read the other side of the argument too, because one of the problems that we face today is that people become trapped in a very one-dimensional worldview. And if you can encourage them to know as much about what the opposition think as your own side of the argument, then not only do they become more rounded in the sense that they understand both sides, but they'll be able to have a much more constructive discussion and debate. So it's quite important, I think, to offer these opportunities. And, we create a situation where they have these debates, but they don't just get away with making cheap or superficial arguments, because we have a panel of judges who are willing to question them and put them under a bit of pressure. Now, putting school kids under pressure these days is not thought to be the thing to do, because we live in a climate where we're unwilling to be a bit demanding of young people growing up, whereas we think that actually being a little bit demanding is one of the ways that children or kids will come out of school at the other end of it with a bit more worldly and a bit more able to handle the pressure of the adult world, so that perhaps when they step into a university environment, then if someone confronts them with an idea that's quite difficult or intellectually discomforting, they'll be able to engage with that idea and to actually handle it. So I think that's an important part of what we do within schools, which then to answer the living freedom side of things, I mean, living freedom is an initiative that I set up in 2017, which is targeted at 18 to 30-year-olds, so people in universities, young professionals. And the idea behind Living Freedom was that we recognize that people often live in quite stifling environments where they're not often or not as much as we'd like offered the opportunity to discuss things in an open way. And we thought if we set up a summer school, which is what Living Freedom has started life as a 3-day summer school, an opportunity for people to leave their universities or their workplaces behind for a few days and come in and meet a group of other young people, not necessarily similarly minded to them. I mean, their starting point might be an issue in freedom and perhaps free speech, but they might be from all sorts of different political perspectives and all sorts of different backgrounds, having studied different things at university and have entirely different experience. But by putting 50, 60 people together in a room for 3 days and opening them up to a little bit of philosophy and history about the roots of thinking about freedom and free speech, but also asking them to engage seriously with some of the tricky contemporary debates around freedom today, then you'd have a productive experience that would leave everyone at the end of it with whether they came out of it completely agreeing with some of the things that have been said or not. They would have had a productive experience in terms of understanding the world a little bit better, and also quite a socially intensive experience as well, which was very much what Living Freedom was meant to do, because we recognise that it's in the informal conversations as much as attending talks and lectures that you gain quite a lot of your understanding and knowledge about the world.
And isn't it, I mean, it's fantastic, but isn't it in a way also worrying that there's been a collapse maybe at universities and elsewhere? I mean, I use that word, but where perhaps people are not expected to read books or even source material. And often there's kind of impacts in terms of people not being able to even write essays by the time they get to university. I mean, is what we're being faced with something really very serious, like at the broader level intellectually? It's fantastic what you're doing there, it sounds like, but what do you think the ramifications are for what's happened to the university and to the very question of like knowledge and who we are and where we've come from, and with a view to always having that about as a sort of rudder to where we're going?
Yeah, I think it is very worrying because young people are being taught to think ideas, controversy is bad, that ideas are dangerous, not something that you can examine and think about and then arrive at your own conclusions as to what you think. I mean, we constantly these days, we think, I mean, the university in the past 5, 6 years, decade or so, has they've tried to create safe spaces where the idea is that you're able to avoid some difficult ideas. You put trigger warnings, for example, on some of the course material because that's judged to be all a little bit too difficult to engage with. So we're very much of the opinion that actually once you're an adult, you should be able to engage with difficult ideas, and universities should do that. Our intervention as a summer school was to create a space to do that. The thing that I've started to do over the past few months is to think, well, how can we bring some of the things that we've learned within a summer school environment into the university itself? And one of the things that we did at the end of last year was we started to do Living Freedom salons within universities, which was an interesting experience. We didn't want to march into universities shouting the odds about, saying cancel culture, well, a load of nonsense or whatever, but we wanted to engage people in a discussion about what cancel culture is and why it's come about and what the ramifications of it are, so that you can have not just a kind of smashing of cancel culture, but a useful argument about where it's come from and how we might deal with it. I mean, obviously, I hope that it is dismantled as a culture, but you've got to think quite carefully about the way of engaging people in discussion in order to be able to hopefully achieve it.
And we've seen quite a few initiatives in the last year or so that seem to be addressing some of those things. If you think about the discussion around the trans question and biological sex and others, where before it wasn't really in the public arena, and perhaps if the public had been consulted and engaged with, they'd have a different view to some of the areas that these are played out. This is one of the things about the policy, right, and where it's done in terms of think tanks, and also whether it goes into the civil service or corporates or others, sort of circumvents having a public debate and discussion. But when the public get involved and there's some light and scrutiny, often, not always, but quite often it's quite different to what the people who are presenting at the policy level, what they think, this is what everyone should do or everyone's agreed with. How are you encouraged by some of those things? What do you think that means moving forwards? And
Yeah, I'm encouraged. So I think to then go with the theme of the transgender stuff. I mean, it's been very interesting the last few weeks. Since the discussions towards the end of last year on the gender recognition reform that have taken place within the Scottish Parliament, which ended up with the bill being passed, and subsequently there's been the situation where the UK government have refused to grant it consent. And I think one of the interesting things about that discussion, which has been going on for a number of years now, actually. I mean, it's not just that it came about at the end of last year, but it's been it's been something that's been coming through the Scottish Parliament in various different ways for a number of years. And the interesting thing about where it's got just now compared to where it was before is that before it seemed to be a discussion that was very much contained within certain sections of Scottish society, but it also has been within certain sections of UK society. So the Scottish government, as devolved executives tend to do, operates on a very tight regime of charities and non-government organisations being the advisors to a set of people within the upper echelons of government who then manoeuvre legislation through, often very poor legislation, actually, as has been proved with this bill, but also a number of other pieces of legislation in Scotland over the years. So Scotland, as an example of what's going on, has these issues suffer from a lack of democratic public debate. And I think the interesting thing that happened towards the end of last year through the hard work of campaigning groups such as For Women Scotland, I think very much deserve a mention in this, is they have brought it to the public's attention and they've made it the property of public debate, often putting themselves in the firing line of some fairly nasty stuff. I mean, they are constantly being harangued and threatened with violence, to be quite honest. I mean, we had someone from For Women Scotland speak at Battle of Ideas last year who dropped into her discussion the fact that she regularly receives threats of violence and even death threats. So to no personal, a lot of personal antagonisms, they have brought this to the public attention. Now it is in the public realm, then what you've seen is that the vast majority of Scottish people seem to be opposed to this. And so it has created something of a genuine public debate, which means that the Scottish government can't just, or they have passed the legislation and they probably will contest it, but not without now a proper debate within the public sphere. And I think that's a very positive thing.
And the thing about proper debates in the public sphere, and we can talk a bit about your salons because you also do them internationally as well, but this idea, I mean, it certainly was lacking, it's been lacking, hasn't it, in the last 3 years. I mean, even parliamentary debate in terms of decisions that were made, parliamentary scrutiny, talking really about the lockdowns and then the ongoing conditions and impositions, they weren't scrutinised in terms of cost-benefit analysis and engaging the public in reflections and weighing up risk and all of that. We were told, it seems like we were told certain absolutes, like it's the science, and then doing policy things on the science. And also now in terms of looking back on that and assessing and evaluating it, things like throwing away a well-established pandemic strategy, pandemic preparedness strategy, and what that means for moving forwards when we have to deal with certain things and how we do that. How much do you think what's your take on it, firstly, and what happened in that period and how we got to hit, some of the things that's a big question, but just in terms of, it seems to me like there was a refusal to actually, even though it was very public in the sense that we got these presentations and being told what to do, and it was always on the news and it was everywhere, very quickly it became something like, this is what we're telling you to do, this is the thing, and that's that, and there's no real debate about it. And also it seems that what was an opposition generally championed it, and when it almost said, let's go further. What do you think happened there?
Well, I think it's probably worth seeing it in the context of the last few years, and especially the European Union referendum, which resulted in the vote to leave, and probably a sense that emerged out of that politics had got a little bit out of control of those who had become very used to just seeing policy through. To be honest, I mean, that's what politics had become, as I was explaining at the beginning. That's why we set up Battle of Ideas, because politics had just become this managerial process without discussion of the big issues. And politicians had become complacent and used to getting their way and just seeing things through. The vote to leave the European Union, I think, drove a horse and cart through that, and all of a sudden a very big, substantial issue, complicated issue, but one of substance, had become the property of public discussion and debate. And if you remember the post-referendum period, there was lots of people saying, oh God, how did we let the electorate take that decision? That's far too complicated for them to be involved in. The pandemic, it seemed to me, sort of, I suppose, almost helped restore the authority of the way that sort of managerial politics worked, which I think, however self-conscious it was, at a time where safety is a kind of dominating value, then it becomes a little easier for people like scientists and those experts in the medical world to say, well, look, here's a bit of evidence, and this is the conclusion that we have to come. I mean, don't worry about the discussion about, a lockdown discussion about the freedom of assembly, because actually the evidence tells us that we have to take and go down this particular route. Or don't worry about vaccine mandates and the question that it raises, big moral question of bodily autonomy, because this is what we have to do in order to survive. So that culture of safety, allied to a kind of managerial mentality in politics, was the way that those political managers, if you like, restored a bit of the authority that I think they felt that they'd lost through the European Union referendum situation. So I think it's a problem and that has obviously continued since then with the getting rid of Boris and Sunak, who's much more of that managerial mentality. So we have, on the one hand, I think at the upper echelons of government, a return of that managerial mentality. But as we've just said, if you look at the transgender situation, then we also have a society that's not necessarily willing to settle for that. So there's a contest of different views and opinions going on. And I think the interesting thing is that whenever the lid is attempted to be kept on some of these discussions, and this very much is the case with the transgender situation, which I think, the UK Westminster government issued the Section 35 notice and thought of it in a very kind of narrow legislative way. But they couldn't keep it like that, because as no sooner had they done it than there was the decision to someone put in the amendment to the online safety bill, which to try and to try and ban conversion therapy. That then became a discussion in Parliament. Everybody peeled off according to their own political views, so that all of a sudden you had a discussion, an open discussion again. So the attempt to keep control and keep all of these tricky issues for politicians under wraps inevitably bursts forward into the public sphere again just now, which I think is a positive thing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, if you think what you're saying about safetyism, on the one hand, the technocratic impulse just to do things and just be quiet and get on with it, but we're doing it for your own safety protection. It seems like what you're saying in terms of the things bursting out is a similar argument that's used around safetyism about the impacts to the environment. So if it's about the ULEZ expansion, for instance, that the Mayor of London's saying, or about low traffic neighbourhoods and 15 and 20-minute neighbourhoods, which obviously have provenance from some time ago, but now they're coming to bear in terms of being implemented. And it does seem to people that at first that thought, didn't like, you know, I know myself when I knew some people who were arguing against them a couple of years ago, but you kind of get a sense, well, maybe it won't be that bad. And is it really, how many of it? And then, but now, if you're in London and certain other areas in the UK, it's impacting everywhere, and people are getting fined all the time, and their routes are being impacted. And there's this kind of disdain, it seems, from many councillors, many elected representatives. Well, it's being done anyway. We're doing it. It's not really, and there's been consultations, but they've been ignored, or certainly only taken a certain amount of note from them, but often where the vast majority said they're opposed to them. So I wonder, do you think something like that is an interesting arena? Because it does strike me that like the people I've met have been involved in it, and Together is doing some work with people because we have obviously signatures and members up and down the country in all the boroughs. But there's a range of different people again, right? There's people who are like in the Labour Party or were in the Labour Party. There's people independents and some Greens. There's a range of different people, some Conservatives, that are all very passionate about what's happened, and they're very particular things that are like they're very concrete in terms of their business or their ability to move freely. Do you think this is one of those things, a bit like you were describing before, like with ULEZ expansion, could kind of sort of blow up and people try and keep a lid on it, but they can't?
Yeah, I think so, and that often cuts across party boundaries, traditional party boundaries as well, in the way that transgender discussion has as well. So I think that's right. I think the interesting thing about the 15-minute cities thing is that it's played out in the world of urban planning. Basically, that's what it is. And urban planning for 20, 30 years has often been the way that managerial politics has been installed. I mean, basically, you have at local authority level or a whole series of agencies and executives, you have a set of ideas in society about things like sustainability that are then pushed through, often without proper democratic discussion. And as you say, even when there is consultations, which I think is a different thing personally from proper democratic discussion, but consultations are often just the gloss at the end of an exercise to try and make it appear as if the public have bought into the idea. The interesting thing about the 15-minute city stuff is that, or the ULEZ, another example where the local authorities in London are now rebelling against it, is that the results of the consultation even have been so, I think 80% in the new ULEZ zone in outer London voted against them, and they're being enforced anyway. So I think these things are interesting. There's I mean, to put it in broader terms, I suppose, and to go back to the EU referendum thing again, I mean, I suppose the way that politics shifted and has shifted over recent decades, and particularly since the 70s, is that national political decision making went upwards, and the government was far more comfortable kind of making its way round the various different councils of the European Union and taking decisions at an international level than it was with engaging with its own public in order to arrive at decision making, in that whole process of parties with big political visions that then had mass membership and sought to win people to their position. that then gave a government an authority because it was implementing what a democratic electorate wanted, went by the by, and all of a sudden decision making was taken above the national interest in these international institutions, but also, quite importantly, it was taken below the national level as well, as decision making became the property of devolved executives, like in Scotland and Wales, or regional assemblies, or metro mayors, or whatever the tier of decision making that was installed below national political decision making. And those bodies, I think, are as undemocratic as the European Union ever was. And possibly the problem when we came out of the European Union was that yes, it was a very anti-Brussels, anti-European Union thing, but we never properly clarified what the importance of national sovereignty, popular sovereignty at a national level, what national politics was all about, which means that when the Labour Party come along now with their proposals for New Britain, which is all about devolving far more powers than exists at present, and creating all these new regional bodies and devolved governments and giving them more power, then what you're going to see is a further draining of the public's ability to engage in politics at a national level, to have an influence on the decisions of the nation. I think that's just as problematic as when we outsource decision making up to the EU. It's equally being outsourced down to these unelected officials and bodies at a lower level. And as I say, that is often conducted through technical processes like urban planning, which, if you take, for example, a city like Liverpool, where important because someone like Lord Heseltine cut his teeth in response to the riots in the early 1980s and the Toxteth situation. And if you look at the way that Liverpool as a city works since then what you have is the emergence of these vast number of agencies and executives that all have influence over how the city of Liverpool is going to develop, way beyond the influence of the public voting for what they want to be done. I mean, it's done in the name of the national failure, economic failure, and the social ramifications of that, the riots in this instance. But what is put in place as to resolve that is a series of decision-making bodies that the public have no control over, and really all that ever happens is that the public is consulted at the end of whatever decision is taken and asked to endorse it, often with very little scope to reject it. So to me, the 15-minute city is a continuation of that process, and it needs to be understood in that context.
It's really interesting. There's a number of things to say about that. I think you have to have a whole event just on that one issue that you just brought up, because it is the case that it can be appealing, the idea that local democracy, and I know certainly when the mayor was introduced, when the position of mayor in London was brought along, it was primarily because there was a complete lack of enthusiasm to local elections and politics, and it was some bring this kind of New York American thing to like rejuvenate a sense of, and in a way cosmetically it's had a bit of that in London. It had that success, and now it's being replicated in different cities, Manchester and elsewhere. But your point about democratic accountability seems to be really, really important. Interestingly as well, Keir Starmer also said, just I think not less than 48 hours ago, what's more important, Westminster or Davos? He said Davos, because you don't have the oppositional kind of old style of people, but basically, and you kind of say now clash of ideas. I'm not sure there's that many clash of ideas in Westminster, but he was making the point that should go really, and it's much better to have the very thing you've just been describing, which is like people internationally, almost like we're the smart, bright ones, we'll make these decisions, and that's much better than the model that we have in Westminster. Isn't that terrifying for someone who's in a democratic country to say that?
Yeah, I think so. But it's now part of the furniture of British the British Constitution and the way that we do politics in Britain. I mean, you've only got to look at things like the way that the Welsh Assembly, then Welsh Assembly, or the Scottish Executive, now Scottish Government, was set up in the Starmer's predecessor, or the big one, Blair, came to power in the late 90s with this idea that Westminster politics was all far too yaboo, hiss, fisticuffs over or shouting in the chamber, not to mention the kind of various scandals that were going on at the time over things like expenses and all the rest of it. So these devolved executives were set up, deliberately set up, as a means to get away from that sort of Westminster environment. And New Labour politics and that sort of attempt to take the cut and thrust out of politics was, writ large in the development of those sorts of institutions. Obviously, Westminster couldn't be reformed to the same extent. Even although they tried, Westminster as an existing institution couldn't be completely reformed. But give the blank canvas situation of Wales and Scotland, then these new parliamentary setups were deliberately conceived and executed and designed in a way that those battles were taken out of politics. I mean, if you look at the way that both those executive or parliaments, whatever you want to call them, work, then, as I was saying earlier, they're very much the discussion goes on in the back rooms. It's the charities and the academics and the advisors who come in and have these meetings outside of the scrutiny of the public. And in Scotland, notoriously, there's very poor minute taking. The discussions are hidden effectively from public view so that you cannot see how the decision-making process takes place. And these are then presented to the Parliament, and Parliament has a set of politicians across the different parties. This has been particularly evident in the recent gender recognition reform stuff. It's not just the SNP, it's very important to recognise that. The SNP have been supported fully by the Greens, which you'd expect, but also by the SDP, the Liberal Democrats, and also to a large extent by the Labour Party. So there's a kind of elite clique in Scottish politics who govern the way that politics is done beyond the electorate. And that was the design of these parliaments. I mean, they've sucked political debate away from the electorate, and also actually, and this is much less recognised but equally important, they've sucked local decision making out of politics as well. So yes, you have a few local authorities that can make their way and are important in decision making, but lots of local authorities these days no longer really have the capacity to make decisions. They're kind of elbowed out of the situation, and it's the executives and their agencies that dominate and define what goes on in local areas.
Well, I want to come on to what you've got upcoming, but on that happy note, what do you think can be done about that if one is interested in democracy, right? I mean, like, if one wanted to challenge that a bit more, how do you, I mean, obviously having debates and discussions, you're putting them on all the time, right? So I get that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think discussion and debate is of absolute importance just now. And the more that these issues are, what's actually going on is drawn out and made a matter of public political debate, then the more we'll be able to get to grips with things. Without that, then all that will happen is these decisions are kind of pushed through, and people think, well, it's the tier of people who enjoy official positions that are the only people that are in any position to have a say. So that public debate thing is not just it's not just that it's nice to have a little discussion of ideas or not. It's actually essential to the democratic process, because without that contest over different ideas, then you won't have politics in the form that we want it. So that to me is the central thing just now.
Well, that's also why we at Together have Take Back Democracy as our one of our key slogans, and we think it's really important that people can get involved locally, particularly at a grassroots level, and have their voices heard. We've seen some interesting things where residents and businesses in Ealing actually got them to overturn the LTNs. We have seen 7 or 8 boroughs where they have got rid of some or got rid of many because locals have insisted on it. We also know from together our own work that we've seen that you can affect change when people get together and they're clear and they're organised, whether it's about stopping the vaccine mandate or on some other issues. With the free speech. You mentioned the online safety bill. Many campaigners that we know at the moment were challenging things like that free online safety bill. And so I think that bit's important because there is a sense of pessimism and fatalism when people see how technocrats respond or don't respond. Oh, they're all just going to do this, and it's very important. And we're coming to the end, but can you just tell us what is upcoming? What can we expect? We didn't even get to talk about prisons and some of the other great work you're doing, but people can have a look online because you're doing so much in so many areas. But what's upcoming for you guys?
Well, lots of things actually. So Debating Matters First, which, as you say, is not only works in schools but works in prisons. It is the 20th anniversary this year of the setup of Debating Matters. So a very big year for us. We have an initiative called 20 for 20, 20 events for the 20th anniversary, where we'll be doing, first of all, a debate inviting schools into the House of Lords, where we'll be putting on a Debating Matters Championship. We'll be doing various regional championships around the country, in London and other places. We will be trying to also bring Debating Matters out to a wider audience through creating a book about it, and means that teachers around the country can just reach up to the shelf, take out the book and put on debates within their own schools without us having to support every single initiative as much as we'd like to support every single initiative. And then finally, Debating Matters is returning to prisons, where we'll be putting on debates for prisoners and giving them a bit of support in advance, helping them to develop their debating skills, and then having a championship on the day in a prison. Living Freedom is hopefully going to go from strength to strength with more university salons. I've done some in Cambridge, as I mentioned at the end of last year. I'm hopeful that other universities around the country will see the success of what we've done in Cambridge and want us to help out doing some in their universities. I'm just about to start programming the Living Freedom Summer School for 2023, which will be the 29th of June to the 1st of July in London. And we'll be advertising that, and young people all around the country will be able to apply to come along to that, to be one of the 60, 70 people that we'll have at that event. And then, I suppose, finally, Battle of Ideas, which will be this year on the 28th and 29th of October, so slightly later in the month than last year. We're having the first thoughts just now about what the programme should be for the festival this year, and we've got lots of exciting ideas that are, yet to be properly developed, but also ideas about new speakers that we can get along, a wider range of speakers, hopefully some interesting people from abroad, from America and from around Europe. So adding to the mix, but as ever, Battle of Ideas will. It'll be about 100 different debates across the course of the weekend in London, and there'll be everything from the culture wars and the arts through to science and technology and education debates, pretty much everything in between, as well as you started to mention a few minutes ago, we also do international events as well, and we're looking at a big event in Stockholm this year, hopefully return to Athens, possibly going to Amsterdam, Copenhagen, various other places. So it really is, people know about the weekend in London. They know less about the fact that we have events around the UK and around Europe over the month before and a month after the London event. So we've got to work out lots.
So just remind us how we find you.
You find us on, Battle of Ideas is www.battleofideas.org.uk. You can also go to the Academy of Ideas website, where you can find our Letters on Liberties Letters on Liberty pamphlets, which we haven't mentioned, but are exciting little 2,000-word essays on contemporary issues around freedom and liberty, written by a whole range of different people. They're available on the website. You can download them, or even better, write to us and buy the physical hard copy, which are really beautifully designed.
Brilliant. And where are you on your socials? Just tell us on Twitter, for instance.
We're at CAD of Ideas, so ACADOFIDEAS.
Yeah.
That's us on Twitter, and we're also, our educational side of things is also on Twitter. It's the bui.co.uk.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for joining us today. Really interesting to listen to you. You got your work cut out for you. Thanks for joining us at Together Talks. We really rely on you to become members and support us with the work we're doing. That's the way we carry on campaigning. It's the way we get more out to more people and do the work that we can. And at the moment, we're doing lots of work around take back democracy. Let's free our streets. Let's get our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues, our loved ones. Let's get with people that we don't agree with and have those discussions and arguments civilly. Let's begin to assert ourselves much more about the way we want to see things in our local areas and also nationally, because that's the way we're going to make sure that we do get to have a democracy that's one that we are going to be proud of. So please join, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.